This is illegal. You're making a huge mistake, and I won't let you get away with this.
The ambience inside Le Jardin, Atlanta's most exclusive and impossibly expensive French restaurant, was designed to make people feel like royalty. The lighting was low and golden. The crystal chandeliers caught the reflections of the city skyline. Soft, live cello music floated through the air. It was the perfect setting for a 10-year wedding anniversary. Or, in Julian's case, it was the perfect setting for a psychological execution. Julian sat across the candlelit table from his wife, Jane. He was wearing a brand new, bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He checked the reflection of his perfectly styled hair in the blade of his silver butter knife. Jane, completely unaware of the impending disaster, smiled warmly at him. She was dressed elegantly but simply. A modest black dress, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back. She looked like the same grounded, practical woman who had worked double shifts to put Julian through architecture school a decade ago. 10 years, Jane said softly, raising her glass of sparkling water. We've come a long way from eating ramen noodles on a mattress on the floor, haven't we? Julian did not raise his glass of $300 Cabernet. He simply stared at her. His eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a corporate shark looking at a bad investment. We have, Julian said, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. But some of us traveled further than others. Jane's smile faltered. What does that mean? Julian reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not pull out a velvet jewelry box. He did not pull out plane tickets for a romantic getaway. He pulled out a thick, precisely folded stack of legal documents. He placed them directly onto the pristine white tablecloth, pushing them past the flickering candle until they rested inches from Jane's plate. Those are divorce papers, Jane, Julian said, leaning back in his velvet chair. He spoke with the casual, breezy tone of a man ordering a second cup of coffee. I've already signed my portions. My lawyers will be in touch with yours in the morning. I'm moving out tonight. Jane froze. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to completely vanish, replaced by a loud, rushing sound in her ears. She looked at the papers. The words petition for dissolution of marriage stared back at her in bold, black ink. Julian, is this a joke? She whispered, her voice trembling. I am the senior vice president of the fastest growing architectural firm in the Southeast, Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. I am closing multi-million-dollar deals with international developers. I am attending galas with senators. And you? You work from home in sweatpants, doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses. You have no ambition, you have no drive, you have a poverty mindset, Jane, and I simply cannot afford to carry dead weight into the next phase of my life. He looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. I have outgrown you, it's that simple. Jane sat in total silence. She did not scream. She did not throw her glass of water in his face. She did not cause a scene in the middle of the Michelin star restaurant. She simply looked at the man she had loved and supported for a decade. She saw the sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from his pores. Slowly, Jane took a deep breath. She reached into her purse, pulled out a black American Express card, and placed it on top of the divorce papers. Happy anniversary, Julian, Jane said, her voice dropping to a calm, chillingly steady register. Dinner is on me. She stood up, pushed her chair in, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Julian smirked, taking a satisfied sip of his wine. He thought he had just smoothly discarded a useless, boring woman. He thought he had just cleared the runway to live a glamorous, wealthy life with his new, 24-year-old mistress. Julian had absolutely no idea that the freelance bookkeeping his wife did in her sweatpants was actually the remote management of a $2 billion private equity fund. And he definitely did not know that less than 48 hours prior, Jane's firm had quietly purchased a majority stake in his architectural company. Julian thought he was firing his wife. He didn't know his wife was about to completely dismantle his entire existence. To understand the absolute, catastrophic magnitude of Julian's mistake, one must understand the secret history of Jane Vanguard. Jane was not a normal freelance accountant. She was the sole heiress to the Vanguard family fortune. Her late grandfather had built a massive empire in commercial shipping and logistics. When he passed away, the entire estate, valued in the billions, was placed into a highly secretive blind trust for Jane. But Jane's father, a shrewd and fiercely protective man, had seen the way wealth destroyed families. He had seen young women targeted by predatory men who only wanted access to the Vanguard checkbook. Before he passed, Jane's father gave her one strict, non-negotiable piece of advice: hide the money. Live a normal life, Find a man who loves you when he thinks you have absolutely nothing, and do not reveal the empire to him until he proves his loyalty for a full decade. Jane took the advice to heart. She moved to Atlanta. She drove a used Honda Civic. She rented a modest two-bedroom apartment. She told people she was an independent financial consultant who handled ledgers for local bakeries and auto shops. In reality, from her modest home office, using heavily encrypted servers, Jane directed the aggressive investment strategies of Vanguard Capital, quietly multiplying her family's billions. It was during this undercover phase of her life that she met Julian. At the time, Julian was a struggling, brilliant, but entirely broke architecture student. He was working part-time as a barista to pay for his drafting supplies. He was charming, ambitious, and seemingly humble. Jane fell in love. Hard. For the first 7 years of their relationship, Jane played the role of the supportive, middle-class partner perfectly. When Julian couldn't afford his final year of tuition, Jane took out a loan, actually just transferring a fraction of a penny from her trust to pay for it. When he was stressed about his licensing exams, she stayed up until 3:00 a.m. making him coffee and reviewing his flashcards. She built him from the ground up. She was the quiet, sturdy foundation upon which his entire career was constructed. And for a long time, Julian was grateful. They got married in a small, inexpensive ceremony in a public park. They promised to be together for richer or for poorer. But then, the money started flowing. 3 years ago, Julian caught his big break. He was hired as a junior architect at Apex Horizon, the most prestigious, cutthroat commercial development firm in the city. Julian was undeniably talented, but Apex Horizon was a shark tank. It was an environment fueled by ego, luxury, and relentless greed. The partners drove Aston Martins, wore bespoke Italian suits, and measured a man's worth strictly by his zip code and his watch. Julian desperately wanted to fit in. And as his salary increased from $70,000 to over $200,000, the toxic culture of the firm completely poisoned his soul. The transformation was slow at first, then violently rapid. First, it was the clothes. Julian maxed out his credit cards, buying designer wardrobes so he wouldn't look out of place next to the senior partners. Then, it was the attitude. He started coming home from the gleaming glass towers of Apex Horizon and looking around their comfortable, middle-class home with visible disgust. He started criticizing Jane. "Why don't you dress up anymore?" he would ask, glaring at her comfortable leggings as she sat on the couch reviewing multi-million-dollar merger documents on her laptop. The other partners' wives wear Chanel. They host charity galas. You just sit here, crunching numbers for mom-and-pop shops. Don't you want to be somebody? Jane would just smile tightly and say, "I am perfectly happy with who I am, Julian." But Julian wasn't happy. His ego had expanded to the size of a hot air balloon, and he felt Jane was the anchor keeping him tied to the ground. Enter Isabella. Isabella was a 24-year-old interior designer who had just been hired at Apex Horizon. She was breathtakingly beautiful, wildly ambitious, and utterly ruthless. She wore thousands of dollars of jewelry, drove a leased Mercedes she could barely afford, and viewed powerful men as rungs on a ladder. She set her sights on Julian the moment he was promoted to a director position. Isabella fed Julian's ego exactly what it craved. She worshipped him. She told him he was a visionary. She told him he was destined to run the entire firm. She looked at him with wide, hungry eyes that made Julian feel like a titan of industry. The affair began exactly 6 months before Julian and Jane's 10th anniversary. Jane was incredibly perceptive. She managed billions of dollars by analyzing human behavior and market trends. Finding out her husband was cheating on her was tragically easy. It started with the classic signs: the sudden changes in his schedule, the late-night client dinners where he wouldn't answer his phone, the heavy, lingering scent of expensive Tom Ford perfume on his collars when she did the laundry. Then came the financial anomalies. Julian thought he was clever by opening a secret, separate checking account to pay for his hotel rooms and expensive gifts for Isabella. But Julian was an architect, not an auditor. He had left his iPad unlocked on the kitchen counter one morning. Jane found the bank statements in less than 2 minutes. Charges for 5-star hotels in Midtown. Charges for a $3,000 Cartier bracelet. Charges for expensive lingerie boutiques. Jane sat at her kitchen island, staring at the screen, feeling a cold, hollow ache expand in her chest. She had given this man 10 years of her life. She was only days away from the 10-year mark, the exact milestone her father had set for her to finally reveal her true identity and transfer half of the Vanguard fortune into a joint account with her husband. She had literally been planning a trip to Switzerland to show him the trust documents. Instead, she was looking at receipts for his mistress. When Julian came home that night, Jane calmly confronted him. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She simply presented him with the facts. Julian's reaction was not remorse. It was explosive, venomous gaslighting. "You went through my iPad." Julian had screamed, his face turning red with defensive rage. "Are you insane? I am networking, Jane. Those gifts are for high-end clients. You have absolutely no idea how the corporate world works because you spend your entire pathetic life sitting on this couch. You're suffocating me with your paranoia and your poverty mindset." He didn't apologize, he doubled down. He made her the villain. That was the exact moment the last remaining ounce of love in Jane's heart completely evaporated, replaced by cold, calculated, absolute zero. She didn't argue back. She simply nodded, packed a bag, and told him she was going to stay with a friend for a few days to cool off. She didn't go to a friend's house. She went directly to the heavily guarded, steel and glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta that housed the executive offices of Vanguard Capital. Jane sat at the head of a massive, black marble conference table. Surrounding her were five of the most ruthless, highly paid corporate acquisition lawyers in the United States. "Gentlemen," Jane said, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. She was no longer wearing sweatpants. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, dark gray power suit. "I want a complete, microscopic financial analysis of Apex Horizon architecture. I want their debt-to-income ratios, their outstanding liabilities, and their shareholder vulnerabilities." Her lead attorney, a silver-haired shark named Harrison, adjusted his glasses. "MS. Vanguard Apex Horizon is a highly profitable firm. Their valuation is currently sitting around $80 million. Why the sudden interest?" "Because," Jane said, her eyes flashing with dangerous intent, "they are about to have a change in management. I want to initiate a hostile takeover. I want Vanguard Capital to purchase a controlling 51% majority stake in the firm. And I want the acquisition completed quietly, under a series of shell LLCs, by the end of the month." Harrison blinked. "A hostile takeover of an $80 million firm requires massive liquid capital, Jane. It will be aggressive." "Do I look like I lack capital, Harrison?" Jane asked coldly. "No, ma'am, we will begin immediately." For the next 3 weeks, while Julian was busy parading around Atlanta with Isabella, completely ignoring his wife, Jane's army of corporate lawyers went to war. They systematically targeted the older, silent partners of Apex Horizon who were looking to cash out and retire. Using a web of anonymous holding companies, Vanguard Capital bought up shares at a massive premium. The CEO of Apex Horizon, a greedy man named Richard Sterling, saw the influx of cash and eagerly signed off on the massive corporate buyout, completely unaware of who the true buyer actually was. The acquisition was finalized and inked on a Thursday afternoon. Vanguard Capital now legally owned Apex Horizon, which meant that Jane Vanguard now owned her husband's entire career. Julian was ecstatic. Rumors of the massive corporate buyout had flooded the offices of Apex Horizon. The partners knew they had been acquired by a massive, shadowy private equity firm from the Northeast. The influx of new capital meant massive expansion. The CEO, Richard Sterling, called Julian into his office on Friday morning. "Julian," Richard said, pouring them both a glass of expensive scotch, "the new ownership group is officially taking the reins on Monday morning. They are cleaning house. They want aggressive, hungry leaders. I am officially promoting you to Senior Vice President of Design. Your new salary will be $500,000 a year, plus performance stock options." Julian's heart soared. He felt like a god. $500,000 a year. He was officially part of the elite. "Thank you, Richard," Julian said, trying to contain his manic excitement. "I won't let you down." "The CEO of the new parent company is flying in on Monday at 9:00 a.m. to meet the new executive board," Richard added. "Make sure you and your team are in the main boardroom, dressed to impress. This person is a ghost. Nobody knows who they are, but they manage billions. Do not screw this up." Julian walked out of the office walking on air. He immediately texted Isabella, "Senior VP, $500,000 a year, we made it, baby." Then a dark, incredibly selfish thought crossed his mind. If he stayed married to Jane, she would legally be entitled to half of his massive new salary. She would benefit from his new stock options. The woman who sat around in sweatpants who didn't match his hustle would suddenly be a millionaire off the sweat of his back. He couldn't let that happen. He had to sever the legal ties immediately, before his new contract officially began on Monday. He had to divorce her this weekend. He called his lawyer, paid an exorbitant rush fee, and had the divorce papers drafted that very afternoon. He booked a table at Le Jardin for their 10-year anniversary dinner on Saturday night. It was the perfect, cruel setting. He would drop the papers, humiliate her, and walk away clean. Which brings the story back to that Saturday night. After Jane left the restaurant, leaving her black Amex on the table, Julian didn't feel an ounce of guilt. He felt liberated. He drank his expensive wine, went straight to Isabella's luxury apartment, and celebrated his new freedom. "I finally dropped the dead weight," Julian bragged to Isabella as they lay in bed on Sunday morning. "She didn't even fight it, she just walked out. By the time my new salary hits the books, she'll be completely cut out." Isabella traced his jawline, her eyes gleaming with greed. "You are so brilliant, Julian. You deserve everything that's coming to you tomorrow." She was right. He did deserve everything that was coming to him. Monday morning arrived. The atmosphere in the massive, glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of the Apex Horizon building was electric. The 10 most powerful executives in the firm were seated around the massive oak table. Julian sat near the head of the table, wearing a brand-new $3,000 charcoal suit. Isabella sat slightly behind him along the wall, holding a tablet, playing the role of his loyal assistant. Richard Sterling, the former CEO who was now acting as a regional director for the new ownership, stood at the front of the room, looking nervously at his Rolex. "All right, everyone," Richard said, smoothing his tie. "The new CEO of Vanguard Capital has arrived in the building. Security is bringing them up now. I want absolute professionalism. This entity just bought our entire lives for $80 million cash. Be respectful." Julian smirked, whispering over his shoulder to Isabella. "Watch and learn, baby. I'm going to have this billionaire eating out of the palm of my hand by noon." The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom buzzed, signaling someone had scanned a master keycard. The doors slid open. 4 massive, stone-faced private security guards in black suits walked into the room, fanning out along the back wall. Then the CEO walked in. Julian had his charming, million-dollar smile plastered across his face. He stood up from his leather chair, ready to greet the titan of industry. He looked at the doorway. His smile instantly vanished. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. His knees physically buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of the heavy oak table to keep from collapsing. It was Jane. She was not wearing sweatpants. She was wearing a breathtaking, razor-sharp, custom-tailored white Tom Ford power suit. Her hair was sleek and perfectly styled. She wore a pair of diamond earrings that caught the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked like a billionaire. She moved like a billionaire. She carried an aura of absolute, terrifying power. She walked to the head of the table. Richard Sterling practically bowed as he pulled her chair out for her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly, "please welcome the majority shareholder and CEO of Vanguard Capital, Ms. Jane Vanguard." The executives in the room began to politely clap. Julian did not clap. His jaw was literally hanging open. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and panicked. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the click. From her seat against the wall, Isabella looked at Jane, then looked at Julian's horrified face. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could smell the sudden, overwhelming stench of fear radiating from the man she thought was a king. Jane sat down. She casually crossed her legs. She placed a pristine leather folder onto the table. She did not look at the other executives. Her piercing, absolute zero gaze locked directly onto Julian's terrified, pale face. The room fell dead silent. "Good morning, everyone," Jane said. Her voice was smooth, cold, and echoing with authority. "I am Jane Vanguard. I have spent the weekend thoroughly reviewing the operational structure of this firm, and I have decided that immediate, aggressive restructuring is required to remove the dead weight." Julian flinched as if he had been physically struck. Dead weight. It was his exact phrase from the restaurant. "Mr. Sterling," Jane said, turning her gaze to the nervous former CEO, "I see you have recently promoted Julian to Senior Vice President of Design, a position with a $500,000 salary." "Yes, Ms. Vanguard," Richard nodded eagerly. "Julian is one of our most ambitious." "Julian is fired," Jane interrupted. Her voice didn't raise a single decibel, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard choked on his own saliva. The other executives gasped. "Excuse me," Richard stammered. "You heard me," Jane said calmly, opening her leather folder. "As of 8:00 a.m. this morning, Julian's employment at this firm is terminated with extreme prejudice." Julian finally found his voice. It was high-pitched, desperate, and cracking. Jane, you can't do this. You can't just fire me. I have a contract." "You had a contract with Apex Horizon. Jane corrected him smoothly, pulling a document from her folder. But Vanguard Capital has dissolved those contracts during the acquisition. Furthermore, your termination is classified under gross violation of corporate morality and ethics. Jane pulled a stack of high-resolution, 8 by 10 photographs from her folder and slid them across the polished oak table. They were photos taken by a private investigator. They clearly showed Julian and Isabella entering hotels, kissing at expensive restaurants, and walking into Isabella's apartment complex late at night. Isabella let out a quiet shriek, covering her mouth in horror as the senior executives leaned over to look at the photos. As the new CEO, Jane continued, her voice echoing with righteous, devastating karma, I have a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding senior management engaging in inappropriate, coercive sexual relationships with subordinate staff members. It is a massive legal liability. Therefore, Julian is fired for cause. He receives no severance package. He receives 0 stock options. His corporate accounts are frozen immediately. Julian was physically shaking. His entire world, his entire identity, the millions of dollars he thought he was about to make, it was all evaporating into thin air right in front of his eyes. Jane, please, Julian begged, completely abandoning his pride in front of his colleagues. Please, let's talk about this. We've been married for 10 years. I made a mistake. I was stressed, please. Jane leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She looked at the pathetic, broken man in front of her. You are absolutely right, Julian, Jane said quietly, so only he could truly feel the venom in her words. We were married for 10 years. 10 years of me playing small so you could feel big. 10 years of me hiding my empire because my father wanted to see if you loved me for my heart or if you were just a parasite. Julian's eyes widened in absolute, soul-crushing realization. The money, the Vanguard name, she had been a billionaire the entire time. And he had thrown her away for a 24-year-old and a leased Maserati. You failed the test, Julian, Jane whispered. You showed me exactly who you are. You have a poverty mindset. You value cheap thrills over loyalty. And I simply cannot afford to carry dead weight into the next phase of my life. She quoted his exact, arrogant words back to him, twisting the knife perfectly. Jane sat back in her chair and gestured to the 4 massive security guards standing against the wall. Gentlemen, Jane commanded, escort this man off my property. He is no longer permitted in this building. If he resists, call the police and have him arrested for criminal trespassing. 2 of the massive guards stepped forward, grabbing Julian roughly by his expensive suit jacket. Jane, no, please. Julian screamed, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face as they dragged him away from the table. I'm sorry, I'll do anything, please. Jane did not even blink. She completely ignored him, turning her attention back to her leather folder. As Julian was dragged kicking and screaming toward the boardroom doors, he looked desperately back at Isabella. Isabella, tell them it meant nothing. Isabella, terrified of losing her own job, physically shrank back against the wall, refusing to make eye contact with him. The moment he lost his power, he lost her completely. The heavy frosted glass doors slammed shut, cutting off Julian's pathetic, sobbing pleas. The boardroom was dead silent. The remaining executives were terrified, staring at Jane with absolute, reverent awe. Jane smoothly flipped to the next page in her folder, picked up a gold pen, and looked up at the terrified room. Now, Jane said, a brilliant, victorious smile spreading across her face. Let's get down to business, shall we? His immediate fallout was apocalyptic for Julian. Because he was fired for a gross violation of corporate ethics, his reputation in the tightly knit, gossipy world of high-end architecture was completely destroyed overnight. No reputable firm in the Southeast would touch him. He was a massive legal liability who had publicly embarrassed the most powerful private equity firm in the state. His massive new salary never materialized. The divorce he had so eagerly rushed through on that Saturday afternoon was finalized. Because Julian had aggressively insisted on a clean break with no alimony to protect what he thought was his new wealth, he walked away with absolutely nothing. He was legally barred from touching a single penny of Jane's Vanguard fortune. He could not afford the payments on his Porsche, which was repossessed in the parking lot of a cheap motel a month later. Isabella blocked his number the very same day he was fired and immediately started dating a much older, much wealthier senior partner at a rival firm. Today, Julian lives in a cramped, studio apartment in a bad part of town. He works as a low-level draftsman for a commercial strip mall developer, making a fraction of his former salary, constantly looking over his shoulder, forever haunted by the ghost of the empire he threw away because of his own blinding arrogance. And Jane is thriving. Under her direct, brilliant leadership, Apex Horizon doubled its profits in less than a year. She stopped hiding her identity. She regularly attends charity galas, wearing breathtaking designer gowns, recognized as one of the most powerful, brilliant female CEOs in the country. She sleeps incredibly well at night in her sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. Unbothered, wealthy, and completely free from the dead weight she finally left behind. What do you guys think of Jane's ultimate revenge? Was the 10-year secret test brilliant, or was Julian always destined to let the new money corrupt his ego? If there is one massive lesson to take away from this story, it is this: be incredibly careful who you step on while you're climbing the ladder. You never know who actually owns the building. If you loved this story and want to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. We read every single one. And don't forget to like the video to support the channel. Until next time, stay humble, protect your peace, and always appreciate the people who loved you when you had nothing.